Hi, this is Joel Berg. I'm CEO of Hunger Free America. We're a nationwide anti-hunger advocacy and direct service organization. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Uh, Unless you're in Hawaii or Alaska and still afternoon. And I apologize if some of you got a bunch of confusing emails from us today about the logistics of this. Our friends at Zoom deregistered people, and then we had to re-register people. Don't worry about it. You're here now. And for your friends and colleagues who may have missed this, we are recording this and are going to share. It's just such an honor to be here with such incredible co-panelists, Mayor Marc Morial, former mayor of New Orleans, and just an incredible leader of the National Urban League. And we'll talk about our partnership fighting hunger. An old and distinguished friend of mine, Jonathan Eig. He's written many biographies, including Muhammad Ali, Lou Gehrig, about Jackie Robinson's first season in professional baseball, about the inventor of the birth control pill. He's working on a book about George Soros. And he also, reason he's here tonight, is he wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But before we start, we have an incredible introductory video from the great congressman from the state of South Carolina, James Clyburn.
Hello. I'm Congressman Jim Clyburn. Let me begin by thanking Hunger Free America for continuing this powerful tradition, the annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Serve-a-thon. I regret that I'm unable to be with you in person, but please know how much I appreciate this opportunity to join you in spirit and to commend your work, honoring Dr. King through service, reflection, and action. For more than 20 years, Hunger Free America has reminded us that the best way to honor Dr. King's life is not simply to remember his words, but to carry forward his deeds. During this year's Serve-a-thon, you have done just that, bringing people together across the country to serve communities, raise awareness, and confront the root causes of hunger and poverty. January 15th would have been Dr. King's 97th birthday. I first met him as a young college student in October of 1960 at a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee meeting on the campus of Morehouse College in Atlanta. The movement was at a crossroads. Some students were growing disenchanted with nonviolent protests. We decided it was best if we met directly with Dr. King himself. Students from all over the country attended, including South Carolina State and Claflin University in South Carolina. I was among them. What was supposed to be a short meeting lasted until nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. Dr. King was fully engaged, thoughtful, patient, and deeply persuasive. He listened. He challenged us. He inspired us. I walked out of that room a changed person. I often describe it as my Saul to Paul transformation. One of the lessons that stayed with me from that night was Dr. King's clear understanding that the fight for civil rights was also a fight for economic justice. He knew that ending poverty and hunger went hand in hand with achieving true equality. Justice to him was not abstract. It was measured in whether families could put food on the table and children could grow up with dignity and opportunity. That is why this Serve-a-thon matters so much. So thank you for your service, your commitment, and your belief that change is possible. I hope each of you has a meaningful, uplifting day of service. And I pray that Dr. King's legacy continues to guide and inspire all that you do. Thank you, and Godspeed.
Thank you, Congressman Clyburn. My favorite story about Congressman Clyburn, that he and his late wife, very well-remembered wife, met during a civil rights protest when they were both imprisoned, and his wife shared her sandwich. with him, preventing him from going hungry that day. So truly a lifetime of service in fighting hunger and for social justice. I'll just give a very quick introduction, and I'll start out with two quotes of Dr. King that are very appropriate for today. One is just a few days before he was assassinated, he said, "What does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee?" Let me repeat that. What does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee? And I love that cup of coffee at the end, because it's not just about substance, it's about dignity. And his clear understanding that economic justice and racial justice must go hand in hand. And of course, probably his most famous speech associated with the MLK holiday and the service efforts around the MLK holiday were his quote from the drum major speech, where he said, "Anyone can be great because anyone can serve." And that's often misinterpreted to give the impression he was just talking about a one-off, packing bags at a food pantry, when in fact he was talking about service in a greater social movement for social and economic and political reform, changing our public policies. So he was always clear that direct action must go hand in hand with the broader call for the whole society to change. And I know John's written about this, I've written about this. A lot of people think the war on poverty, the Poor People's Campaign that Dr. King started and the Reverend Ralph Abernathy ably advanced after Dr. King was assassinated, along with Coretta Scott King. The narrative is that the whole thing failed because, well, Dr. King was assassinated, the thing went away, we still have poverty. Well, that's not quite true. One of their top demands was the creation of the modern nutrition assistance safety net. They pressured first President Johnson and his administration, and then soon after that, President Nixon. And it worked. By the late 1960s, we started to create the modern, what was food stamp program and then SNAP program, matched school lunches with school breakfasts, started the WIC program for pregnant women and children under 5. And by the late 1970s, we almost entirely ended hunger in America. So obviously we had huge other poverty problems in America, but the truth of the matter is that safety net expansion pushed successfully by the Poor People's Campaign almost ended hunger in America in the 1970s. Well, why are we even having this discussion today? Because in the 1980s, this country outsourced jobs, crushed unions, slashed the social safety net, and poverty soared. Hunger was supposed to be a temporary problem during the Reagan recession, and soup kitchens and food pantries sprung up all across America. They were supposed to be temporary, and now there are between 40 to 60,000 of them in America, because we've sort of collectively accepted this as the acceptable status quo. I know the people here today don't accept this as the acceptable status quo. And just real quickly, in the last year, between 2023 and 2024, the number of Americans living in homes that couldn't afford enough food shot up to 48 million people. 48 million people. The Trump administration stopped counting after that, but there was a 500,000 person increase in food insecurity, hunger in America between 2023 and 2024. Today in America, the richest country in the history of the world, 1 in 5 of our children live in homes that can't afford enough food. And it's not just cities. It's not just some of the poorest rural areas. Every suburb in America has incredible inequality of wealth and hunger. And it's not really about food distribution. It's about inequality of wealth and the lack of affordability in America. And I know John, as a historian, as a biographer, and all of us will say it's real dicey to say what someone who passed decades ago would stand for today. But assuming he was consistent in his later decades as he was in the decades that he lived, had Dr. King lived, I cannot believe he would not be aghast at the America today, not to mention the threats to democracy that he fought against and that are coming back. So that's my brief introduction. I really want to have this a broader conversation. So I'll turn it over to Jonathan Eig, who again just wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Dr. King. Tell us a little about Dr. King's, why he focused so much on poverty and hunger, and why, in his mind, he tied that so much to the struggle for Black civil rights.
Thanks, Joel, and thank you for all you and your colleagues at Hunger Free America are doing. It's such important work, and Dr. King would certainly be cheering. He'd be marching. He'd be leading the band as the drum major, as you pointed out. It's very important to note that, as Representative Clyburn pointed out, even in 1960, King was struggling. People were criticizing his nonviolent tactics. And after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, people were criticizing him again, saying, why are you focusing on economics? Why are you talking about income inequality and poverty and hunger? We just gave you everything you asked for. And we have this tendency to forget that King all along was talking about these issues. Even during the Montgomery bus boycott, early in his career, when he would travel to New York and Chicago to raise money, he would point out that the cities had problems of their own and that he was coming back to talk about it eventually. And those problems included segregation, but segregation was just one piece of the puzzle. And if you even listen to his words at the March on Washington, his most famous speech, it was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And he says in that speech, before he gets into his soaring I Have a Dream portion, which is improvised, the part he wrote out, he says that America had written a check that had come back with insufficient funds, and that the people who had been enslaved in this country and their children and grandchildren were going to have to be compensated. It's not enough to give folks the right to vote. And as you said, it's not enough to desegregate lunch counters if you can't afford a hamburger. So he was making this quite clear. And as a result of that, his popularity began to plummet. By 1966, 2/3 of all Americans said they disapproved of Martin Luther King. And as we know, by that point, the government was surveilling him, listening in on his phone calls, wiretapping his phones and his hotel rooms, trying to destroy him, trying to break up the civil rights movement. And it's not just because they were concerned about seeing racial discrimination be eliminated. They were concerned that he was attacking the fundamental architecture of capitalism. And when he began talking about the Poor People's Campaign, that's when it really got bad. That's when J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI produced a memo saying that Malcolm X is dead. Martin Luther King is the only one left who could become the Black Messiah. And they were afraid that he would destroy every advantage that they had built for themselves by maintaining this system of repression. And that, some people think that's what got him killed. But I just want to point out that as the Poor People's Campaign was beginning, and they were planning basically occupy Washington, D.C. until the government agreed to things like safety nets that included guaranteed income and guaranteed jobs. As you pointed out, Joel, support for food, support for childhood daycare. King was having a very hard time getting anybody to support that mission. He was counting on thousands of people to occupy Washington, D.C. And as of the spring, he had only dozens of people signed up. And that's in part because the media was bashing him relentlessly. He was also beginning to speak out on the Vietnam War. King always thought of himself as a preacher, as a minister. His job was to save souls. The activist position was sort of an afterthought. It came along with it. If he was going to save the soul of the nation, he had to take to the streets. He had to protest. He had to work on political change. He absolutely believed that government was the greatest force to make those changes and that he had to work with that system. But as a result of that, his effectiveness was diminishing. And he felt like people weren't listening to him anymore. One of the side effects, one of the ironic benefits of those wiretaps is that we have transcripts of his phone calls. And we can read his words as he's talking to his friends, to Andrew Young, to Stan Levison, and to his own wife, to Coretta, saying, I feel like no one's listening to me anymore. They don't want to hear about militarism and materialism. They don't want to hear about the poor and the hungry. And he really didn't know what to do. And while this was going on, as you know, he was asked if he'd come to Memphis. And his advisors said, that would be a waste of your time. It's a local issue. It's just some sanitation workers. Why do you need to go to Memphis? We need to stay focused on the Poor People's Campaign. But the sanitation workers were exactly the people that he was talking about, the people who were not being paid fairly, the people who did not have union benefits. Two men, Ethel Coles and Robert Andrews, were crushed to death in the back of their garbage truck because they couldn't get out. They weren't allowed to sit in the cab during this driving rainstorm. So these are the people King was ministering to. And he felt like he needed to call attention to the working conditions for the people who were working full-time jobs and still unable to get by in this country. And that's why he was in Memphis on the last night of his life. And I just want to close by reminding you of another speech that we all know pretty well, his mountaintop speech, the last speech of his life given to those in support of those sanitation workers in Memphis. But we know the part at the end of that speech where he talks about that he may not live a long life, that longevity is a blessing, but that doesn't matter anymore. He just wants to do God's will. And he may not reach the mountaintop. He may not reach the promised land, but he knows that his people will reach the promised land. But before that part of the speech, he talks about the importance of protest and the importance of organization. And he says that we live in this country that he could never imagine that we might be susceptible to the kinds of conditions that we see in China or Russia, that we have these basic rights here that we sometimes overlook: the right to free speech, the right to free assembly. And the greatness in America, he says, lies in our right to protest for what's right. And even at this moment in his life, when he feels like no one's listening to him anymore, he still believes that this country can change and that it's not going to change on its own, that we have to do the work. And those are the words I want to close with today, that King said, we must never lose our infinite sense of hope. We must adapt to change and never lose our infinite sense of hope. And I feel like that's what we're doing here today. And that's what Hunger Free America reminds us every day.
Thank you, Jonathan. Just one quick point. As you noted, he was very, very critical of unbridled capitalism. But as you noted, he was very critical of China and Russia as well. He was very critical of Marxism. And I think it's fair to say his sort of ideal society, don't you think, would be closer to sort of Scandinavia today? Heavy taxes on the rich, less inequality of wealth, virtually no serious, poverty, but still free civil liberties.
I do think that's very clear. I think he was there all along. Some people say he was only going there late in life. I think if you go back and look at his college papers that he was writing, he was there all along, very much in that spirit.
In the American context today, you might say he would have been a democratic socialist.
But I would say that of all the people out there in the political world today, Bernie Sanders probably comes the closest to capturing King's economic vision.
Yes. So Mayor Morial, I know the National Urban League has been combining work on economic justice and civil rights forever. But tell us a little bit about your guys' history on that and how that intersects with Dr. King's life and the movement.
So first of all, thank you and good evening to all. I want to thank you, Joel, and thank Jonathan for that walk through history, which is so important to get beyond sometimes the superficial narrative we hear about Dr. King in the media as a part of the celebration of his birthday. But I also want to thank the Albertsons Companies and the Albertsons Companies Foundation, because they've worked through Hunger Free America with us on policy advocacy and direct service work. Part of our direct service work is to help people sign up for SNAP or food stamps, sign up for WIC, sign up for school lunch programs so that people can fully take advantage of those programs that indeed are there. There is no doubt that economic justice was a component of Martin Luther King's message, his advocacy, and his work. But I think what is striking is how relevant his message is in America today. And I just spoke at a number of activities over the weekend and today at a church in Brooklyn. And one thing I shared is what would Martin Luther King say if he came and took a peek at America 2025? America at 250. I think he would say, this is interesting. He would see diversity of elected officials, African Americans and other communities of color, and women serving in positions in Congress, in the Senate, in city halls and state governments all across the nation. And he would learn that there had been an African American president, an African American vice president, that there had been an African American attorney general. And he would be quite, I think, impressed with the changes that really were the fruits of not only the Civil Rights Act, but particularly the Voting Rights Act. But then if he picked up the paper or turned on the news and saw that military-style operations were taking place in major American cities, brought to you by the current president and the current administration, all designed ostensibly, quote unquote, to make us safe, but in truth and reality, to profile immigrants, to eject them and evict them from the country. And if you told him that there were 60,000 immigrants in detention camps in America today, and he saw that the Supreme Court was about to disable the Voting Rights Act, and that there'd been a broadside attack on the Civil Rights Act through the challenges to diversity, equity, and inclusion, Dr. King would be dejected and angry. Dejected and angry. And if he knew that since the year 2000, America had spent $25 trillion on wars, and had just passed a fiscal blueprint that gave trillions in tax cuts to the top 1%, while at the same time cutting food programs, health programs, and eliminating the Department of Education, he would be dejected, and he would be like many of us, angry at the state of affairs. He would see an America at the proverbial crossroads. At 250, when America should be celebrating the last 50 to 60 years of progress, instead, America is questioning. Some in America are questioning the necessity, the viability, and the rationale for that progress over the last 60 years, which Dr. King's People's Movement played a great role in bringing about. And this is where we are today. Economic justice, economic opportunity, civil rights are intertwined, go hand in hand. As we say in New Orleans, they go together like red beans and rice. In New York, it goes together like a hot dog and mustard. In Philadelphia, like cheesesteak and the cheese. They go hand in hand, and you can't separate the two in terms of what it means for the quality of life for people, their rights and their right to live in safety and in prosperity. So I am also proud that at this juncture that I lead an organization that stood as one of the 6 civil rights organizations in 1963 that sponsored the March on Washington, and reiterate what Jonathan shared with us earlier, is to remind people it was a march for jobs, and freedom. And that the union movement, thanks to A. Philip Randolph and Walter Reuther, were one of the prime engines behind that march on Washington. And that coalition of working people and civil rights was one of the drivers of much of the progress we saw in the 20th century, particularly in the mid-20th century. So we're in a state of emergency, folks, and we need to understand it as such. And that state of emergency is because the progress of the 20th century is being challenged in a frontal assault. Number one, progress that we made over the role of government. It began with the New Deal. It accelerated under the Great Society. That government at the federal level had a dynamic responsibility to the economic well-being of its people. And then the second great movement of the 20th century, the movement for civil rights, that had as its apex the 1960s, which changed America for all Americans, for the better and for the greater. These two are under attack. The OMB director, Russell Doge, does not fundamentally believe in a dynamic government that's responsible for the well-being of its people. Stephen Miller is the architect of this assault on civil rights through a range of unlawful and unconstitutional executive actions. Be that as it may, where we are today is we must heed Martin Luther King's call to function as thermostats and not thermometers. Not people who simply take the temperature of the room or the temperature of the nation, but people who want to set the temperature of the nation in response to what we are seeing. Dr. King's celebration must be more than nostalgia. It must be, as Hunger Free America has continued to say, how his teachings, how his words, how his activism is relevant to the issues of today. So we must fight and fight back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And for all you listening, we do want to take audience participants' questions. So please go into the Q&A function. It's under other functions. If you're not available for Zoom, just type in your question, please. Now, Jonathan, Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, correct?
Correct.
In 1963, when he didn't win it, did he threaten to invade Greenland because he was pissed? Just kidding. I had to throw that in there. And please, any mega lovers, we hold all sides accountable. A little humor here. So one more serious question I want to ask is, not everything Dr. King tried and not everything the movement tried worked. He had significant setbacks like the Albany campaign in Albany, Georgia, where he was sort of the other side was just less obviously demonic, that they undercut, the movement. And certainly in Chicago, again, while I say he laid the predicate for significant advances trying to bring, civil rights and economic rights to the North, I think most people would say he was not particularly successful bringing it to the North. And one of the most, I had to have a sardonic laugh, as I know your wife, and we're old friends. Your wife runs a nonprofit. I run a nonprofit, Morial runs a nonprofit, and the Southern Leadership, Christian Leadership Conference was a nonprofit, and they were always trying to raise funds. And I had to sardonically laugh at a rejection letter from, I think it was the Ford Foundation. Anyone Ford, we still want your money. Urban League and Hunger Free America still love your money, but they basically said in sort of foundation ease, oh, well, you didn't have enough sort of demonstrable metrics for success in coming up to the North Front. We're all smiling because we all have seen that in rejection. But I think the undercurrent was, oh, when you were taking on those bigots in the South, we Northern liberals loved you. But when you're coming up now talking about poverty in the North and discrimination in the poor, we're going to find some excuse not to fund you. So you can talk about that. What did he learn from the successes and lack of successes? And again, not to extrapolate too much a few decades in the future, but how can we best apply that to today?
Well, first of all, Joel, I think that King would have gladly given his Nobel Peace Prize to end racism. And in fact, he donated all of the money from his Nobel Peace Prize to his nonprofit organization. And he did, fail over and over again. We think about his career as being this string of successes from Montgomery to Birmingham to Selma. But it was 6.5 years between Montgomery and Birmingham. And I challenge you to name one giant success that he had in that time. And what he was learning along the way as he failed over and over again was that a big part of his job was to shine a light on injustice and to keep shining that light until enough souls were touched, until enough consciences were struck that they felt like they had to do something about it. But that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough just to shine the light. He had to have solutions as well. And as I said earlier, he believed that government had to be a part of the solution, that nobody had the power and the budget to make the kind of fundamental massive changes that was required. And that's why, you know, he went to Chicago, because he thought it's not enough. He wasn't there just to point out that Mayor Daley and Chicago had segregated housing and segregated schools. He wanted Congress to put forth a Fair Housing Act so that Chicago would be a case study. And he knew that by showing up there, he would be the attraction of the media, and that he would shine a bright enough light that perhaps he could move President Johnson and move Congress to consider fair housing legislation to end some of those conditions that he was experiencing and showing the world when he was in Chicago.
I
And
think
so what
one of
we're,
the
go
interesting
ahead,
things
Mr. Mayor.
about Chicago is, and it's my view, that had he had more time and had he continued to work on the groundwork, that the movement would have had greater penetration in the northern American cities. It's important to recognize that it was at that time that Dr. King created the Operation Breadbasket Initiative within SCLC, and that initiative ended up being headquartered in Chicago.
That's right.
Led by the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And the organization SCLC, Operation Breadbasket, became People United to Save Humanity, or PUSH, which was Reverend Jackson's organization. So the work against segregation and redlining and de facto discrimination in the North became, I think, the work of Dr. King's devotees and Dr. King's legatees and others to carry on that work. I think he was laying the groundwork in Chicago with the Poor People's March, with his connection of the dot of militarism and the juxtaposition between spending all this money on wars meant it wasn't being spent on food, it wasn't being spent on housing, it wasn't being spent on healthcare. And that narrative is a narrative that takes a tremendous amount of effort and work for the American people to grasp the connectivity between the two, because sometimes people feel we can have it or want it and pay for it all. So that's my, to a great extent, perspective, you know, on the movement into the North. And look, it's important to recognize that in the North, you had the Nation of Islam, and you had in Chicago a tradition of African Americans serving in elected office all the way back to the 1930s, including Bill Dawson, who was a member of Congress, all the way back to the 19th, Oscar DePriest, and later Bill Dawson. So you had a different situation in Chicago. However, a great component of Chicago's Black community were from Mississippi. And so they experienced de jure segregation and oppression in Mississippi and came to Chicago in pursuit of opportunity as a part of the Great Migration, which meant that the circumstances there were a bit different. And had Dr. King had time, I think he would have mastered it.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, by some metrics, American public schools may be even more segregated than they were at the time of Brown versus Board of Education. And a lot of people tie that to the still segregation in the housing market of America. Do you agree that's the main cause? And if so, how does that further prove the problems of poverty and racial injustice are still, unfortunately, tied hand in hand?
I think one not need to be a social science expert to understand that segregated schools were the product of segregated neighborhoods and segregated housing. because Americans' love was with the neighborhood school, the little red schoolhouse that our kids could walk to school, that everyone in the neighborhood went to school together and knew each other. And why school desegregation was not successful had a lot to do with the fact that it disrupted those patterns, and that the movement never tackled the underlying problem of residential segregation, which was the product of redlining and a whole host restrictive covenants, block busting, and many, many strategies of the early, whether the middle 1900s, the 20th century. There's no doubt. And that's why, to some extent, the movement in education has moved more to trying to ensure a quality education, regardless of the composition of the classroom. Equal outcomes, equal funding, equal programs, equal sufficiency of teachers and facilities, and these sorts of things, because it was very difficult, and we still have not put a finger on addressing the problems of residential segregation, nor the problems of housing affordability in America, which have been exacerbated since the year 2000.
Yeah, and John, as you know, a lot of people trace sort of the white backlash that led to first the nomination of Barry Goldwater, then more successfully the election of Richard Nixon, and then Ronald Reagan, to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But I think it was really the Fair Housing Act that really drove the segregationists, most batty, and that really, caused, the backlash. Can you talk about, the challenges, King faced in fighting for, housing reform?
Well, it's, one thing to send a check to the SCLC when you're living in the North, and it's another thing to see those policies that affect your neighborhood. And people were scared, and that's part of the eternal forces that are used to try to A, get politicians reelected, and B, to push back against change is fear. So the fear of someone new moving into your neighborhood was a massive force, and we saw it in Chicago when King led marches in Marquette Park on the west side, and white people came out, with KKK signs and Nazi signs, and King was struck with bricks. The idea of bringing this to the North was terrifying to people who might have once been supporters. And King left Chicago saying that the racists of Chicago could teach the racists of Alabama and Mississippi a thing or two. But we see after his assassination, really the nation has a choice in how we respond to his death. And one alternative was to push for serious housing reform, to push for some of the things he was talking about in the last years of his life. And that was a real option for this nation. And we chose not to go that direction. We chose to really respond with more law enforcement, actually, in those neighborhoods that were being depopulated by white folks. And that was a tragic result that we're still living with today. Certainly still living with the results of that in Chicago today, where I live.
Right. And it's not just people who identified as conservatives back then, as you'd say, Klan lovers, but plenty of liberals. White liberals weren't too happy with true integration in their neighborhoods. There's the famous Phil Oak song, The Critique of Liberals from the Left. Love me, I'm a liberal, with the line, I love Puerto Ricans and Negroes as long as they don't move next door. And I live in a very supposedly liberal neighborhood of Brooklyn that's gentrified dramatically. And when I moved in about 24 years ago, there was a massive rally against a homeless shelter coming into the neighborhood. Much of the language against it was racialized. Most of the opponents were white and had significant resources, and they would be aghast to be compared with conservatives. But the truth is that, as critical as I am of conservatives, there are plenty of liberals who don't walk the walk, when it comes to fighting for true equal rights. And certainly I know you live in Chicago today, and Chicago is also a city not without its still massive, segregated, housing patterns.
That's right. And you saw a lot of families continuing to send checks to the SCLC while they were moving out to the suburbs to get away from the changes that were coming.
Now, you You have written at length about lots of figures in the Black community. Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, and sometimes they're misunderstood. Particularly by white society, and you've chronicled how much differently the Black press treated all those figures than the white press. What do you think the most misunderstood parts of Dr. King's legacy were, particularly among the white population? As you indicated, he was very unpopular among the majority of white people on the time of his assassination.
Well, I want to pivot on that question a little bit and talk about what we're seeing today. The creation of the national holiday has had this bizarre effect of watering down his message. When I interviewed Harry Belafonte, he thought it was perhaps intentional that Ronald Reagan, in giving King a holiday, knew that we could co-opt his story and turn him into a much less threatening figure by sticking to the parts of the story that didn't offend us. And when you think about the March on Washington, what lines can people quote from that speech? They can quote the line about the dream. They can quote the line about content of our character. But do they remember that he talked about police brutality? Do they remember that he talked about income inequality and even reparations? No, because the national holiday has had this sort of anesthesia-like effect of numbing our brains and letting us forget that King was a radical and that his radicalism was rooted in his Christian faith. But it was nevertheless radical and made him deeply unpopular. That's not the story we tell on the national holiday. So I think that the media is still playing a big role in that. And I think we need to encourage people to stop showing the same clips from those speeches. We need to encourage our school teachers not to teach just the second half of that speech. I had a teacher friend, I suggested, give your students the first half of the I Have a Dream speech and ask them who they think wrote it. And they were shocked to hear that it had come from Martin Luther King. So we need to push back against that. And I say that as a member of the media. We can't allow King's story to be manipulated in ways that would shock and offend him.
I agree with that fully and completely. And I think the shift to making Martin Luther King Day a day of service, while laudable, also steals from the fundamental message and from an understanding of what he represented in American life. We don't do holidays well in the United States. They all become days off and they become commercialized, and we just don't do holidays well in the United States. There's no, organized activities. Although I will say I attended 4 Martin Luther King celebrations this weekend, and mostly sponsored by African American organizations. 3 of them were churches. That there's still a place in America. Maybe it's a little bit outside the mainstream, where the true meaning of the message and efforts to apply the message to today's conditions are still right and strong. The panel discussion I participated in at the Apollo with a young professor I'd never met from Harvard, Brandon Terry, was excellent in its depth of analysis and really sharing a number of the things that Jonathan has just shared with us today. So I think we have to push back against the effort to sanitize and anesthetize Dr. King's message and meaning. I said today that we have to remember Dr. King was a man of action, not just a man of speeches, not just a man of great philosophical perspectives, but a man of action who took action. Going to Memphis was action. March on Washington was action. Birmingham was action. A man who went to jail, a man who sat in, and a man, as we've learned, been reminded tonight, failed in a number of efforts, but never gave up.
Great. And, I believe that the only time serious positive change happens in America is when a social movement pushes somewhat receptive political establishment to do more than they otherwise would have done. I would argue that LBJ never would have been able to get that civil rights legislation through without Dr. King and the broader movement. But I'd also argue, had Barry Goldwater won the election of 1964, we wouldn't have had that legislation after 1964. Do both of you agree with that?
The more provocative thing is whether, if Kennedy had lived, whether we would have gotten the legislation through. because while Kennedy was for it and was reluctantly for it, it was Johnson's acumen in meeting the moment that broke the filibuster in the Senate. That was necessitous to passing. I think it's provocative as much as Kennedy and Johnson may have been a package to an extent. A lot of times I ask myself, wow, maybe if Kennedy had lived, we would not, on one hand, been more mired in Vietnam, but on the other hand, would we have gotten civil rights in 64 and voting rights in 65? That's, I think, very, very interesting. I think, no, clearly, if Goldwater had won, there would have been no civil rights bill.
But also clearly, had there not been a civil rights movement, there'd be no civil rights bill.
Oh, without the movement, there's no question. And I think Johnson was smart enough to see which way the movement was going. And I think Johnson also, because he fancied himself, Jonathan, you can check me on this if you don't agree, as the next FDR. So
Absolutely.
He was shooting for the history books. And I think understood in his heart and his soul that civil rights was a way to put himself in the history books.
That's right. And interestingly, Johnson thanked, when he was congratulating King on this important legislation, he said, we have Bull Connor to thank for this. And the point he was making, I think, is that Bull Connor helped give him cover, helped give the white politicians a reason to say, we've got to vote for this, because he's making a case that no one else could make. And King was smart enough to recognize that would turn hearts and minds.
The reason I asked about social movements, I know the Urban League works on this a lot, and certainly Hunger Free America does, is, to me, to end hunger in America, we need a social movement effectively demanding it. And I've studied social movements virtually my whole quasi-adult life, and even before that. John, we're frankly high school friends, and we both started early. But successful social movements, in my judgment, do three things. Number one is convince people in the middle. Not just people at Brooklyn and Berkeley, coffee shops, or Lakeview, coffee shops, but people who are really on the fence, who are persuadable. Two, respectfully, democratically, peacefully rebut the opposition and reframe the narrative to not let them advance a false narrative. But I think the most important thing is empowering the people most affected. And I argue that no social movement in the history of the world has been won by one people on behalf of another. If it was just up to men, women probably still wouldn't be voting. Sure, there were white allies, and you document them in your book, and we've all worked with them, but without Black leadership in the civil rights movement, we wouldn't have had that leadership. And so I think his greatest insight was that the poor people's movement needed to amplify the voices of poor people themselves. Hunger Free America is trying to do that. We're organizing things called food action boards, where we recruit low-income people lived experience with our issues, to advise us, to speak out to policymakers, to testify, to speak to the media, to tell their stories. So I wonder what both of you think about that. Do effective social movement, how important it is for the people most affected to be the voices of the movement and the leaders of the movement?
I think I respond in this way. I think what's needed today is a lot more investment in channeling the activist instincts of young Americans into understanding that what made the movement so powerful is it had legislative objectives. It had policy objectives. It was about shining a spotlight in its earliest days, but then it became about the Civil Rights Act and fair employment practices and the Voting Rights Act. And I think we need to realize that we have new energy among young people that understands activism. But what I also don't want young people or people to think of as activism as being distinct from voting and participating in the political process of electing people, that the two have to go hand in hand if you are serious about change. As an elected official, I was a legislator in Louisiana. I could propose a bill. As mayor of New Orleans, I could propose bills. I could sign executive actions. I could make budgetary priorities. As president of the National Urban League, I can ask somebody to introduce a bill. I can ask somebody, pressure somebody, demand that somebody take an executive action. We've got to understand that the two go hand in hand in full and complete use of the tools of democracy, which are the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, and how those three things go hand in hand with voting and participating in the legislative and executive processes of government.
I agree with you 1,000%. The so-called activists who disdain working with even like-minded elected officials are foolish and ineffective. The most infamous example, when Occupy Wall Street chapter outside of Atlanta refused to allow John Lewis to speak. If that doesn't exemplify self-destructive foolishness,
we've got and to some extent, part of it is whether you go back to the suffragist movement, which was also an activist movement that included marches and demands, the labor movement, and the civil rights movement. It's to understand the interplay and the desire to demand policy changes, practices and changes, whether they be private corporate practices, policy changes, legislation, creation of agencies that would protect those rights. And we've got to do more to help a generation that wants to channel its energy into activism, how to connect all these dots.
Great. Lindsay, I didn't see it, and maybe I'm looking wrong. Did we get any questions?
We do have some questions.
Go ahead.
For folks. What actions can we take as individuals, and how can we inspire those around us to help uplift our communities and create large-scale change?
First, go to nul.org, nul.org for nationalurbanleague.org. Then go to hungerfreeamerica.org. If you can, we all have instructions on how to advocate. If you can afford to donate. If you can afford to volunteer, do. And so work with respective organizations, think globally, act locally. So that's my short advice. And we always have action alerts. Right now, you should push your senators and congresspeople, particularly Republican ones, in the year-end budget bill to delay some of the implementation of SNAP cuts. States are being asked to pick up half the administrative costs of SNAP starting immediately, and that's going to cripple food for 42 million Americans. So that's a direct advocacy activity people can do right now. And the Capitol switchboard is 202-224-3121. They're probably not answering the phones now, but call them tomorrow morning or go to our websites. Mayor or Jonathan, do you want to respond to that?
Jonathan?
I'll let you do it. You guys are.
I think you captured it.
Okay. Volunteer, advocate, donate, and make your voices heard. Look, I know a lot of people are scared now. My great-grandparents were forced to dig their own grave before being shot by Nazis. And I may be shot by Nazis, but I refuse to dig my own grave. And not to be hyperbolic, we are the gravest threat to democracy in modern times. And for other organizations, I know the mayor gets this and Urban League gets this, but for other activists say, oh, we're going to focus on our issues. We're not going to focus on the preservation of democracy. If you think democracy is going to go away, but the new dictators are going to be good on poor people's issues, that's nuts.
There's no question that democracy is foundational to everything.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Next question is for Jonathan. When do we begin to see a watering down of MLK Jr.'s messaging?
Well, I think we begin to see it almost right away with the creation of the holiday, that we just begin teaching it his story at this very safe level. It's almost, you're introducing curricula for elementary school students, and we're not really practicing how to advance that, how to take them to the next level, and how to think more critically. I do think, my kids have been taught the letter from Birmingham jail in school, in junior high and high school, and I applaud that. But we have forgotten that King's own speeches and books are still in print, and we're not encouraging people to read King's own words anymore. We're just cherry picking the words that make us comfortable. And I think it started as early as the 1980s, really.
Okay.
Another question submitted in the chat regarding mobilizing new generations of would-be advocates. Are there any additional examples of groups doing this especially well right now that you would point to?
I think there are certainly civil rights organizations, immigrant rights organizations, and labor unions. Some of the more progressive labor unions organizing low-income people are doing really important work. So I'd say for our work, those are really key allies. Mr. Mayor, any addition to that?
I would say this. I see lots of local activism that may not be hooked to anything national. I also see situational activism where people come together around a particular issue. And what enables that today is the use of social media, the ability to communicate and to organize through the use of social media, which is a completely new tool to communicate to hundreds of thousands of people, literally in 10 minutes. Outrage on an issue and proposals to address it through mobilization and rallies and et cetera. So I see a lot. So a lot of this, when I travel, I see it. But it's not high on the radar screen, and it may not be, connected. You saw some of this activism, the No Kings movement you see now, that has some organizational framework behind it. But generally speaking, I think the energy is at the local level.
Great. One more question, Lindsay. Close it.
What gave MLK Jr. the courage to live his life the way he did? It's a big question.
That's a great question. I think, just to say it very briefly, it was his faith in God and faith in democracy. He was willing to sacrifice for those things. And I think that's part of why his message resonated so much. It's not controversial to stand up and say, we love this country so much that we're willing to sacrifice for it.
My mom
ahead.
was a classmate of Dr. King at Boston University. And what she told us, we heard these stories from the time we were little, is that Martin was a gifted person, a gifted orator, a very special person, even when he was in his 20s. Sometimes we ask ourselves, what gives people courage and conviction? It's all usually a sense of faith, a sense of hope, a fearlessness that comes from sometimes forces we don't even understand. But truly, he was a gifted man. Look at his words and look at his writings. I mean, he never reached the age of 40. And this is an incredible body of work. He was gifted.
Amen.
So let me close with this. I think one of the greatest gifts of John's book is showing that for all his gifts, Dr. King was very mortal. He was scared to death. He was very worried about being assassinated or harmed. And so that made his courage all much greater, right? That he wasn't ignoring that. He knew that and still did it. And just reminds me of my father, who volunteered in World War II after Pearl Harbor. He left college to volunteer for the Air Force. He saw friends shot out of the sky. I was a young kid. He died when I was young. Never thought he was particularly brave. And I thought, it must have been fearless. How? And then I saw his diaries from the Air Force. And he was scared every day. I won't go into the details of it, but manifested then in some very, profound ways. So it's not that people are superhuman and impervious to what happens to human beings. It's the courage to go forth anyway. And I'll just close with this. We can't guarantee that fighting back will win, but we can guarantee if we don't fight back, we'll lose. And the only thing in history that's ever worked is people banding together, good-minded people, to fight for the justice we need. America's the only industrialized nation on the planet that has this level of poverty. America's the only industrialized nation on the planet that has this level of hunger. And if we truly want to make Dr. King's dream a reality, we must end racism, and particularly institutionalized racism. We must end war and violence, and we must finally end poverty and hunger. With that, thank you all. Thank you, Jonathan Eig. Thank you, Mayor Morial. Thank you, the National Herald. And thank you all. I see many old friends and colleagues and supporters here. It's great to see you. I hope to see some of you in person soon. Thank you all.